today's presentation, strategies for dictionary development and text analysis for the prediction of economic time series. This presentation will be by John Aaron and Paul Medioli. John is a project manager and data scientist for his company Milestone Planning and Research for over 30 years. And as a consultant, he focused on facilitating enterprise business transformation initiatives using various project management and data science tools, including AI, text analytics, and media analysis. John also served as the adjunct professor for data science, supply chain management, and project management at Elmhurst University. And John is a frequent presenter of Lunch and Learn, also for Progress Research. Paul is a data scientist with a broad cultural and linguistic background that uniquely informed him of his work with text analytics. While studying classical language at Kenyon College, a fascination with biology introduced him to how powerful and incisive analytics tool can be. He would go on to maintain and contribute to several research databases over the course of his field and laboratory work with the Organization of Tropical Studies and Cano Palma Biological Research Station. And Paul's facility with complex system and his grasp on broad range of scientific, cultural, and linguistic concepts provide him with a uniquely holistic and nuanced approach to text analytics. On those words, I give John control.
So, hello, everybody. And for those of you that have heard me before, nice to see you again and talk to you again. I think Normand pretty well described the purpose of what we're talking about. This was basically in the sign-up sheet. So what we want to do is continue a discussion about text mining in terms of, and tying it into prediction of economic time series. And what we're going to do this time is, last time when we spoke a bit about using machine learning for topic mining and so on like that, we're going to be dealing and focusing more on the sentiment dictionaries. There's various types that are available, various products that are available. And what I think the key thing that you'll be looking for in this is that what Paul did is that he took and in terms of not just making our own value statements about what's a positive word or a negative word, but we're looking at words that were positively and negative correlated to a target. And that target in this case was the S&P for, it's a publicly available time series. But the key thing is that this is a process that can be applied to any company, whether you're using CRM or supply chain or whatever with your customers in terms of sentiment. And we're going to show you the results of that versus other items. The other thing that I think is most important is Paul's work in what I would term the measurement of psychological attributes, such as fear. And in some of the previous webinars we did, we spoke about that. And even with a biased media or a controlled media, the point is that what we're looking for is if they're consistent, then it becomes predictable. And so would, in fact, some of these measurements, psychological measurements that we can extract, can we apply those to improve our prediction and forecasting in time series? So those are some of the essence of what we're doing, and we're going to continue to use this time series that we've been using since the end of August 2022, and we do this every day. And we now have over 29 million words in it we use for headlines. So enough of that. A little bit about the background here before I turn it over to Paul. What we're doing is that when we look at predicting any time series, you kind of have to look at context. And the S&P, like anything else, is kind of a measure of economic health. And if you want to understand like what's going on with it, well, you have to go back a long ways to see that there's been this long upward trend that's gone on, and it's kind of being driven, you could argue, by the Federal Reserve and the market. And there's, when you were above kind of there, you have opportunities to sell at a higher price. When it's low, you have opportunities to buy. And so what's kind of becomes important is, can we predict turning points and use these other series and text to be able to do better than kind of the standard economic predictors that people use, such as like the volatility index or other types of measures that come out of the Federal Reserve and so on. And so as some context to show you where we actually started our measurement of words and extracting words on a daily basis, is that what happened is that the S&P has been kind of following a long upward trend, and that's been facilitated by the Fed in terms of interest rates and money supply. And what happened with the pandemic, though, is everything changed, because right away they dropped the interest rates, which ultimately led to changes in the consumer price index, because they also increased the money supply. So there was all this jitter going on during the pandemic period. So where we started taking a look at our daily samples was kind of after the stabilization started, which was really around the first or end of August 2022 or the 1st of September. So ever since then, what we've been doing is looking at the measurement of sentiment and other things just by doing a balanced sample of text extractions from different services that are politically balanced, hopefully, as well as we can, yet as small as possible and robust so that it could predict and understand what's going on and changes in terms of what's being reported and topics and so on. So there's what you're going to see is that we're looking at two series in particular. One is the actual S&P itself. The other is the deviation from this kind of general trend that the Fed is driving. And it's kind of a deviation from target. And both of them show different things. And some have better properties than others for using time series analysis. So you're going to see a comparison with two series. So here's a case where we're looking at the actual S&P, and this is an extension of what we believe the Fed is driving towards by controlling interest rates and money supply. And then you've got all the noise and jitter and the psychology of are they going to raise the rates or lower the rates? And so the market is interpreting by this, and that's kind of manifested, we believe, through these deviations from plans. So in some cases, the deviations are almost always below, but in some cases, they're like right now, a period where they're above. And so these are two separate series that we're using to correlate our extractions of sentiment and other psychological measures. So kind of keep that in mind when you look at the actual series versus the deviation from that target that we see that we're looking at both. And we kind of started with the basis and just doing our own analysis. My background's in economics, even though I don't usually do this kind of work, macro kind of work. But we built a 3-equation model. Actually, we reduced it to 2, which was we're taking the S&P index, which is a function of the linear growth target plus that deviation from target, which is kind of an accounting identity. But then this deviation from target, we're saying and postulating it's a function of sentiment, fear, the expected fund rate policy, or the interest rates that the Fed is doing, plus periodic shocks that are coming in. And the periodic shocks are basically Markov events, which kind of have some probability, whether they're being periodic or aperiodic kind of events. And we've been exploring that. And text analysis allows this kind of work that goes beyond what standard economic indicators would provide. So our objective really is to demonstrate how text and analytics operationalize this as approach. The dictionary development and sound sampling are key, we feel, and Paul is going to be speaking a lot about that. And then the lessons learned that we can extend to any other time series. And then the other critical point that kind of came up at our last luncheon learn is that if the media is in fact controlled and biased, and we've looked at that many times, and there's evidence to say, yes, it is, but if it's consistent in those manners, can it be predictive and help in the actual predictions we have there? So in terms of the text analytics approach, real fast, I've been taking these daily samples, now over 29 million words. We're focusing on headlines from a balanced sample, a politically balanced sample of news sources. And we collect the daily stock market. We use Wordstat extensively for the sentiment and psychological dictionary development and extraction and measurement. As I said before, the thing that Paul is really going to hit hard is developing sentiment dictionaries that are already kind of with words that we know are either correlated positively to our target, grade 0.2 Pearson product correlation coefficient 0.2 or greater, or negative 0.2 or less, right? and see how that performs versus some of these other available dictionaries. And then what Paul did was this, what I really feel is a major step forward in psychological measurement of extraction of this, is the fear dictionary that he put together. We also looked at disorientation, which kind of came from John Boyd's OODA loop. We didn't have such great results with that, but we had these economic shocks from topic modeling that in fact kind of give us a sense of disorientation that the psychological approach from Boyd would suggest. So we use Minitab extensively for machine learning and regression time series, predictive analysis, but we also use Stata for time series and multivariate forecasting, and Scientific Computing Associates, SCA. And my colleague and good friend Bill Ladiak from SCA also kind of helped me with some of the time series on this. So what we've got then, as we kind of lead into this, is daily extractions of data, where you have different topics. And I can, if we have time, I'll show you how the different signatures of topics tend to occur over time. You see these things. And so the question is, do these events provide us with some ability to forecast and correlate with our target? And so for the sentiment, which frequently is done, you have positive words, negative words. This reflects the time series path that of positive words that Paul put together, negative words that are based on correlation, negative 0.2 and greater. And then our sentiment analysis, the way we did this, focused on the ratio of positive to negative word counts. And part of the reason for this is that when you have momentum swings like this, and if you're trying to find the robustness of a dictionary, it's that positive to negative, because you've got some words that are positive, some that are negative, and some that are neither. And so what you're looking for is, we believe, at least I personally believe, that's that ratio of positive and negative that really separates the power of a good dictionary for sentiment versus one that may be confounded by momentum and things in the series itself. The other thing is, typically because of sample size changes on the daily thing, we typically go for words per 10K total words, that rather than just word counts when we display graphs and things like that, to normalize that, okay? And so as we get into this and we lead into what Paul's going to talk about, is that we looked at all sorts of dictionaries, right? Paul put together the ratio of negative correlated to positive correlated one based on the correlated words, negative or positive, and the correlation coefficient to this S&P is 0.78. To the deviation from target is 0.5. The other one that we turned out quite strong also, especially for the deviation from target, was this Hugh and Liu dictionary. They're from my alma mater, UIC, and you can find them out there. There's another set of positive and negative words. That turned out pretty strong. And then we've also, although I didn't really do too much in this one here, we have dictionary for polarization. We use the Loughran and McDonald uncertainty. That's what L&M is. Loughran and McDonald Probalis is the Probalis dictionary. And then the negative shock one, I developed that one. Paul did the fear one. And what you see is that we've kind of, these here, we all use these ones in red from time to time. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Paul right now. And Paul, you want to get into building that positive to negative sentiment dictionary that you did customize. Go ahead.
Certainly, yeah. So as John mentioned, this was built using extracted headlines from a very broad sampling of news media sources. And that was expanded and reinforced through plural and conjugate and tense variances to make sure we increased our coverage and weren't creating blind spots for ourselves. And then these were sorted by correlation coefficient in regard to the comparison with the closing S&P values for that day, which gave us a very good idea of the effective kind of impact of each word's sentiment on market value and people's willingness to make certain choices. And this became, as you'll see in the figures coming up, a pretty broad, effective barometer for the impact of this media sentiment. But this dictionary also means that we now have a wide rhetorical database for the kinds of language that these news media outlets tend to use, and a pretty detailed picture of how powerful this language can be in this arena. The polarity of these words can also be quite counterintuitive. Words like obscurity or justice or impeachment have a lot of uh, kind of public sentiment behind them already, but the way that they impact this particular arena can be quite counterintuitive. And so here we can have a look at the predictive power of these various dictionaries. On the left, we see the correlation coefficients with the raw S&P closed data. And you can see it follows the general trend, but it misses some of these sort of spikes and turning points. And then it begins to sort of drift off on the end, which I personally believe is could be indicative of like a linguistic shift because the Hue and Liu graph on the right, which compares to the deviation from the target, is a much better predictor and seems to strengthen the notion that it's not, an economic shift. But we can see that the sentiment modeling is a very good broad predictor of this. And now here we see basically the same two graphs, but using the fear dictionary that I put together. And you can see it has a very strong negative correlation in both contexts, but the deviation from the target is much more direct. So this appears to be a pretty powerful tool as far as measuring this particular impact and the predictive ability of it. And so building this dictionary was interesting because we have to think about how we communicate fear. And most of the time, we communicate fear through the characterization of a threat. And the characterization of that threat often takes place in a sort of theoretical or a metaphorical space in which we or the people we're talking to are sort of at the center. And then we describe threats in terms of their spatial, temporal, and axiological relation to ourselves. And what that means is the spatial relation is sort of the action or speed or the concreteness of the threat, like urgency, or like intruding or invasion or obstruction. And temporal is sort of how imminent, how newsworthy, how direct, like, urgent, oncoming, or already. And the axiological is related to the magnitude or the character of the threat with personal consequence and sort of gustatory response and ideological opposition, like chaos, defeat, disgust, that kind of stuff. And these are all very sort of useful rhetorical strategies for establishing and reinforcing meaning. The use of natural and medical metaphors leverages a lot of cultural and emotional response. The attacking of legitimacy decreases trust and personal certainty and relevant power structures. And also the use of hyperbole to frighten and confuse and shock. Very extreme language, superlative language. And so the dictionary was built in several different semantic blocks of nouns, adjectives, and verbs according to the proximization axes that I mentioned before, the spatial, temporal, and axiological. and also words of delegitimization, uh, words relating to sort of scandal, corruption, exploitation, deception, and wrongdoing. Words of hyperbole and spectacle, as I mentioned, like horrific, obliterate, irredeemable, and metaphorical language like bursting with, or oozing with, or like a flood or an animal. Um, these are all very sort of common rhetorical strategies that are used to accentuate and manipulate fear. And these were also expanded via conjugations, plurals, and tenses. These were also cross-referenced with the previous sentiment dictionary to double check tone and make sure relevant words hadn't been missed. We also experimented, or I also experimented with other semantic blocks like scarcity and uncertainty, but those were actually found to be much more effective in terms of topic modeling, and whose function was a lot more specific as far as these go. So they weren't included in the fear dictionary. But we can see here how the modeling of these topics sort of fits on a broader um, sort of ideological map, where sort of shock and disorientation uh, and political action uh, and sort of general fear all are sort of uh, arrayed. Um, and these are all different kinds of uh, negative language that uh, have very particular impacts on the S&P.
Yeah. One thing I'll add to what Paul is saying is that when you're dealing with principal components, it's kind of like a mega topic, right? That you can kind of look at this grid and say that component one versus component two. This does show that really the shocks and disorientation is orthogonal or not completely related to fear. They're separate constructs. And the other point is that if I looked at this, some of you are media people, I know you may be familiar with the work of Marshall McLuhan, figure ground, that the things that come out and hit you right away is what McLuhan called the figure. And you got politics and you got shock oriented events, but the ground, the background, is often what I would consider tied to fear and some of this fraud types of things like the crypto and election fraud, things of that nature. They're both important, but it's what hits you in the media is often these figure points, which are the shock and disorienting events, but these are also very important in the background. But they're kind of laid out in this grid when you do principal components analysis. Paul, go ahead.
Oh, and so here's a selection of graphs modeling specific negative shock topics and their effect on, well, and a few positive shock topics and their effect on the S&P close in relation to their prevalence in the media. I believe you had a few words about this as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also showing, I think, the power of topic modeling, right? To be able to show this and the sensitivity of the dictionaries that, or the topic modeling that came right out of the Wordstat functionality. And it turned out to be very, very useful, right? So what we said was that sentiment itself is not terribly predictive of turning points. But when you look at these shocks that come in, these surprises types of things, those are. The question is, can you predict those, right? And that applies both to positive items. So the absence of fear, such as a fear of an economic recession, that's kind of a positive shock, right? It's the absence of a problem. And likewise, Fed rate cuts, and those are quite positive. Paul, you want to go after this one?
Yeah, and this is using the dictionary on fear and our various dictionaries. A set of figures that about the relative sentiment used by the news media in comparison to various sort of national corpuses. And so we get an idea of how consistently distorted the language of these news media sites is. And here we can see right here on the right, the news media sample is scoring way, way higher on fear at a baseline than any of the national corpuses. And so, yeah, and we can find that it's not as, again, significant with the disorientation broadly. So they're not hitting that as hard. Um, However, we can see things like polarization are again significantly higher than normal. So this is something that they do appear to be driving, or
Right.
something that appears to be driving sales.
Right. Black versus white, liberal versus conservative, gay versus straight, whatever, right? It's that polarization
Yeah.
that's measured here.
Yeah, and we see similar to disorientation, the uncertainty is actually a bit in line, and so that is uh, less specific to the efforts of the news media.
Right. This was the Laughlin and McDonald uncertainty that we used for this one.
Yeah, and we can see the how this is probably the the most significant difference, but the use of negative words daily is way more prevalent in the news media than in any of the national corpuses. So um, it's clear that there are a few things that are being driven there.
Okay. All right, Paul. We want to leave some time for you to ask questions of Paul on some of the items he came up with, which were very, very technical and very interesting. The thing that I'll pick up on following that is this idea of shocks. That to be a good forecaster, we're finding, at least of this time series, it's you have to have sentiment, but also you have to have this ability to understand when are the shocks coming. And so one of the things that I looked at was I created a shock vector by normalizing all the different items that Paul talked about, of those individual shocks, and I normalized them into a complete vector, and to kind of come up with the highest shock for the day, right? The highest score for the day. And what comes up with are things like what I'll call 6 sigma level, 8 sigma, and 10 sigma. Obviously, 10 sigma is the highest level item here. And try to figure out, is there a pattern to these shocks? Because to do a good forecast, you've got to be able to project in the future, not only sentiment, but when are these shocks coming in? And so what we're seeing is that a 6 sigma shock or above occurs about once every 7 business days, or once every 10 calendar days, okay? And if we kind of look at these, and I converted these into square waves, so if it was above 6, it got a 1, so I could look at this. By being selective, not all of these affect economics, right? Not all of them do. And so you have to be a bit selective. But when we look at those shocks that affect the economy, and you try and figure out using Fourier analysis, is there a predictable pattern, a sine wave frequency that fills these? For a while there, it was looking like it was pretty close. I think we had about 5 out of 7 that were it predicted a shock coming in with a constant frequency. But when we look at what's happened, say, since the start of the winter of December, November, December, what happened was that started going away, right? We could not. And so the question is, of course, well, is the stock market currently overvalued? Are they going to get back into this kind of swing that's going on? And one of the precipitating events here that seemed to throw things awry was the Israel and Hamas war escalated. That's when that kind of came out. So the original pattern, the original sine wave pattern that we were seeing was about every 80 days, there was a economic shock. that kind of came in. But now one of the things we're going to do is kind of continue following this to see if this kind of shifts or if there is some sort of a thing there. And I've been also testing for randomness and things of that nature. Now, traders do look at like Fibonacci retracements, where they can look at when there's going to be a max to a minimum, or if it goes down, it follows Fibonacci cycles often quite well, as we can see here. But that doesn't tell you when these are going to occur. It tells you the level it's going to fall off. So there is some value in that, in looking at that. And if we go and we take this a bit further and we build a regression model, an economic model, and we adjust it with trying to get rid of serial correlation by adding a residual lag in here, what you see is that by looking at these different negative shocks, fear, all these, and we kind of group these together, they build the potential of a fairly decent fitting model, right? And in this case, there's no significant correlation to the residuals, so that means it's pretty clean when we look at this deviation thing. But if we actually tried to predict the model, what I used was a three-stage least square model, where in fact, to predict the actual S&P, that was one equation, which was really close to the identity equation that I talked about. But then the actual deviation from target, which feeds the S&P, along with that target, the trend, is a function of fear, recession fear, ratio of positive to negative using the Hugh and Liu, Fed rate cuts, general fear, negative shocks, polarizing, and then this other factor I put in here to remove the serial correlation. And so you end up then with the that kind of a thing. And the other observation here, and I got to be careful about my time, right? Let me check, make sure I'm not running things. Okay, we got time. The one thing that you notice is that a lot of times when you see shifts, you'll see a shift in volatility as well. Like this is recession fear. So you can see that it's kind of going up and down, and then all of a sudden it gets stable at a lower level. With interest rates, it's kind of just the opposite. It's Fed rate cuts, same thing. It's very, very low, and then all of a sudden it comes up, but it's very jittery day by day. So you can smooth these out, or you could just use volatility as a predictor. And that in itself becomes useful. So that's just a tidbit of useful information. So then as we go through this and we actually chart out using 1 period ahead forecasting. So we're not just looking at fits, but we actually I put this into Stata and is doing 1 period ahead forecasting using three-stage least squares. You see it fits pretty well and it gives forecasts. And this was done on the 29th. So this was like 2 weeks ago, right, that it did this. And it did kind of predict that it would level off a bit here, right? And I believe it did, although I don't follow this every day, in that because it seems to be so overextended, right, compared to that deviation from target, it has to turn, you would argue, at least if history is a guide. So the model fits pretty well. And certainly you want to weigh not just statistical evidence, but also expert opinion when you're doing forecasting. We don't give financial advice in this webinar, right? It's really just to talk about the use of these, but it's up to you to use this. So again, please keep that in mind. I'm not a prognosticator for the stock market here, nor is Paul. But this is a way, this is what the model produced it statistically. And then if you combine that with expert judgment, you're probably on a good, safe track there. That kind of is the technical aspects of what we wanted to talk about. But now some of the challenges with a few minutes that we have left. And again, our point is simply this, that text analytics provides you a new dimension, a useful dimension for time series analysis and for forecasting that goes beyond the typical predictors that economists tend to use or traders tend to use when they're doing this. I think it's, you've seen some of the dimensions of it. Sentiment is important. The shocks are very important. Understanding and getting a stable series, that's why we use the deviation from target. It lends itself more to time series. But there are certain challenges when you do what we have done. One is that the news sources can try and block scraping. A couple of them did that. And I had to go in to preserve the balance that I have politically. I had to go in and manually try and do this. And in some cases, that made it, kind of takes time. That I'd love to run the MATLAB program to just go in and extract and then put that into a text file, upload that, and then put it into Wordstat. But in some cases, you have to take those extra steps if they start blocking these, and they have ways of doing that. The other case is the news source site changes their design, and they may even change their philosophy about things, and you have to be able to accommodate that. And that leads to sometimes regime changes that may even reflect a philosophical change. And so your sample gets shifted, and sample size changes. Some days they post lots, others they don't. And sometimes, as I said, the philosophical regime may change. So we've been doing this now for over a year and a half, and you start to experience these things that you don't ordinarily if you just look at a short series. It's possible, like what Paul was showing, that the dictionary needs refreshing. As you saw, the Hugh and Liu, the correlation one was performing very well, and then all of a sudden it stopped performing as a predictor. And so understanding that, so it could be that we needed to refresh that. Okay.
The other thing, and account for,
yeah,
as you said, as there are, linguistic and philosophical changes in these news sources, there are also shifts in linguistic connotation and sort of public appearance of certain words
and
over
that's
time.
A very, very, very good point, Paul. Very good point.
These do require constant update.
Yeah, yeah. Then the other one is now that's not all that much different than any machine learning model, right? You got to refresh them, and that there's nothing really new in that concept. The other one is HTML can contain spurious words leading to false conclusions. So in other words, like before you get the news article itself or the title, you have to extract the HTML, and that contains a string. And then in that string may be very important words. And then every day you're getting that same word because it's in the string, right? So you have to kind of go through the word by word to see if you see a flat pattern in what you're doing for word by word, because it in fact may reflect that it's in the HTML, not the news title itself. The other thing is more as an econometrician, the difficulties in reducing serial correlation and multicollinearity. You have to be careful with that. That's something that one of the reasons why that deviation time series was very helpful. Also, the database size is 29 million words. So processing time now takes time. And so your data architecture for this, as it grows and grows and grows, need to consider that. And so I have to deal with it. I went and bought a faster computer to help, but even that's starting to be stressed a little bit here, okay? The other one is a very, very important point, and that is when we are dealing with propagandistic or controlled media, the importance of something may be signaled by the fewest number of mentions. Now, let me explain this a little bit. So here's the database, right now as it stands. And what you might want to see is just take a look at the time signatures over here on the right. So as I cycle through each of these topics, you see how you get different signatures, right? Those are very telling of things, right? And as data scientists, we are taught that the most number of mentions is reflecting importance, right? As we go through these things, right? And that goes, as far as I can tell, that goes back to Frank Ramsey's work in the late 1920s, right? In terms of this idea of frequency is tied to probability. But when you're dealing with a media that is controlled, which we have just explored that, I'm not going to go down that path because we've talked about that. You can go to some previous webinars on that if you like. I looked at it both from the political left as well as the political right. All of a sudden, we invert things and we start looking at the least covered topics, such as Texas wildfires that could grossly impact the beef supply. of food. A bizarre thing going on about euthanasia and assisted suicide, especially not as much in the States as it is in Canada and Europe. Bird flu, which can affect the supply of eggs and chickens. Chemtrails, what are they spraying in the skies on us? The economic sanctions on small farms and farmers, mail-in ballots. And you get the idea that sometimes it's those things, in my opinion, the things that are not mentioned or mentioned very infrequently are the items that can also be extremely important. And that really, to a great extent, changes the data science paradigm, because we're all taught to look at the highest frequency types of things, right? But censorship changes the game a little bit, potentially. So I just wanted to kind of throw that one out there for your consideration. So in terms of, as we start to get towards the end of our discussion, for Paul and myself, the idea is that you can apply this text analytics and time series to many things in a business. It doesn't have to be public sector stuff. We chose this because this is public information, right? It's readily available. But if you're looking at, for instance, customer relationship management databases, extracting how customers are feeling about things, looking at trends on them, potentially supply chain types of items like that. All of these become uses of unstructured data that is not readily in a typical, like Normand presented me as a consultant that works in business transformation. I do that. I work a lot with SAP and in putting those kind of things in ERP databases and systems. Almost all of those systems are tied to structured databases that have numbers. They're deterministic numbers in there. But when you're dealing with unstructured data, such as text, could be emails, could be customer relationship management, text kind of things. It could be customer service correspondence, things that all those are in there. And looking at that and mining those for trends, all that becomes very possible when you start dealing with text. And that is the ultimate objective that we really want to get at. And the ability to factor in what Paul did, such as psychological constructs in those kind of things, becomes very, very powerful, because we're all motivated by fear, uncertainty, doubt, things like that. And customers are too. So the ability to see that and get ahead of that and predict ahead of that becomes very, very useful. And so I think that's kind of where we're at. Paul, any closing remarks on your here before I turn it over to Q&A?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well. This is the ability to take a large amount of unstructured text and extract sort of important information about the mood of it or particular issues that are represented in there is really powerful for any kind of sort of problem solving when you're dealing with that kind of stuff. I think it's very powerful and relevant stuff.
Okay, great. Okay, Normand, any questions?
Please, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat features of Zoom, and I will try to read those. Let me first start by making comments. First, great presentation. And I love the fact that actually Wordstat, the dictionary, did not necessarily fare pretty well, because it allowed me, and your presentation is a great illustration of that, to focus on the fact that indeed dictionaries should be customized, and there's no sentiment dictionary that will necessarily work in all situations. And we develop our dictionaries on specific data sets, which are not necessarily trying to predict time series or analyzing news. So I think it's a great point to stress, and it's something that we have tried to stress as well. You need to customize your dictionary. And I'm curious also, because you did mention, I believe, that by developing dictionaries and looking at correlation, you did find some unexpected words or things that were either counterintuitive, for example. And I would love to see some example of that.
Yeah, like again, we're justice, recommendations, obscurity. These were all things that had very surprising, to me at least, uh, uh, correlation coefficients, as far as what they drove in the market being not necessarily how they make us feel.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, also like impeach, the word impeach, like I built a negative dictionary once and I would have put impeach as a negative word. But in this case, it turned out to be a significantly positive word, right?
right,
A word like detain, a word like greed, right? A word
right,
like obscure that turned out to be significantly positive, which ordinarily I would say, using my set of values, the way I've been brought up, is it would be a negative word, right?
right. Whereas things like justice and recommendations had more of a negative impact.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So Normand, that kind of gets to what you're saying, right?
Indeed, to give one example, when we were analyzing customer feedback about flights, and the most negative words was the word told, T-O-L-D, which is basically
Hmm.
every time something's occur, you have to go to the customer support and they will tell you something. And the word told became the number one predictor of people who were not satisfied. So because it indicated that something occurred. So that's great,
Right.
great insight. So I do have one about cross validation. So, for example, typically when people wanted to test a model, they will actually keep some data out so that they will can be later test their model. Is it something that is possible with that kind of project you do?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So for instance, now we've been doing this for quite a while, right? So when you do machine learning, so I'm going to show you the Minitab, one of the more recent files I've used. So when you, for instance, are in fact, let's say I was trying to predict the market here with using machine learning, not necessarily time series. So what it does automatically when you take these types of things, so this is the S&P, and then you could just take maybe Hugh and Liu, their ratios here, and I can run this in here. I can add predictors or whatever. Almost always what these things do, Normand, is that they contain holdouts. So you have a test portion of a data set. You train it and you test it with holdouts. And the same with classification. So all along, we've been using these standard machine learning types of methods in there. Now with time series, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do because if you start taking samples of time series, generally what people will do will take daily data and make it weekly data and so on. It's not as much, but all along we've been using these standard machine learning validation types of things.
There's a question. John is asking, okay, some of the work I've done deals with tracking mentions of particular competencies or abilities that people use to do work. Have you investigated the usefulness of this kind of information to predict market changes?
Can you say it one more time?
Okay. The question is really trying to measure mentions of competencies or abilities that people use in their work. Have you considered measuring those to see whether they could predict market changes?
Well, no, I haven't because I've never had an application where I'm trying to look at competencies, although in the background, my mind is processing, right? Because I might have in some way. But generally speaking, what you want to do is take that variable that you're trying to predict and figure out how to operationalize that. And what you may find is that there are multiple kinds of words in there. So it's almost like when you're doing topic modeling. I'm kind of talking off the top of my head here. Topic modeling. If you were to, for instance, take like either factor analysis or principal components and look at words that kind of constitute together. So, when you in fact do I showed an example of this here. Maybe this will help. I'm struggling a little bit to try and answer this, but if you take all of the items, all the words, you could do this with words, not just topics. But if you took these and you ran, for instance, a principal components, what you might find is that you have groupings of words that are close together that form a construct, such as competency, right, in a certain area. So the first thing I would do, this is kind of unsupervised learning, it's called, whereas machine learning is supervised learning. What I would do would be start with all my words, and then I would use the Wordstat topic modeling, or what I would do would just run my own principal components or something and look for clusters that might start to measure what it is you're trying to get at. And that would be one of the first things I would try to do with kind of a ambiguous type of topic such as competency and something. So maybe that'll help, maybe it won't, but that's what comes to mind.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say that and in terms of its relation to what we're doing, that those kinds of words could potentially fit into like a uh sort of a positive context as far as things like legitimacy and confidence in certain institutions. But um,
So maybe building a dictionary, Paul, right, would be
yeah,
what a person could do, right?
exactly.
Would be to build your own dictionary around this, and you would look for correlated words or things that are either positive or negatively correlated. That would be a good idea too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hope
Yeah,
that
maybe
helps.
there are existing dictionaries as well that
Yeah.
listed some of those skills and competencies and abilities. Who knows?
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
and and I don't know anything about them.
Okay. Okay. I don't know. Maybe John knows, but
Okay.
I think we may have had a question sort of earlier on.
okay. There's someone who asked about the recording. Yeah, the recording will be available from our website, from the webinar page. So that has been answered. And if you see some,
Hello, did you have a chance, in addition to the sentiment analysis, to do analysis linked to how many separate events were reported for each? For example, where there are positive articles, would you analyze if all these linked to the same event, or if potentially there were two or three different events uh, reported with positive sentiment? Uh,
Well, we really did not look at sentiment related to events unless it was the S&P we're talking about, right? So what we did is, essentially what we looked at. Let me try and find these here. So we looked at the sentiment itself and tied it to the S&P or to the deviation. That's what we looked at. And we looked at the turning points, tied those to specific topics. But in terms of correlation, for instance, you would see if I took, for instance, the Israel and Hamas war, and I took this series and I tried to run a correlation with the S&P, it would be very, very low because it is a singular event. And I might put it in there as kind of a binary dummy variable, and it would probably show to predict that one downturn. But what I did to try and make this as powerful as possible was create a vector of like this, a running vector of events that were extreme events, extremely reported events, and then run this as a series and compare that to what we were doing. So hopefully that, I don't know if it answers the question, but that's what we did. And
okay,
how
maybe a last question. I haven't seen this question on my chat side. So if you see any question that I don't, but I do have one question here. Does this suggest that political success tend to come from the redefinition of conventional language?
I will say that it goes back as far as ancient Greek and Roman politics to reframe a new idea as an old idea that we forgot about. So like presenting a new idea as an ancient tradition. Um, I mean, I would say that political success comes from a very intentional and uh, measured use of language, and that can include using it in new ways. But um, uh, that would be, I think that might be a pretty broad correlation.